the Teach Pitch podcast. We are very excited to be launching a series of interviews for Teach Pitch, a global community of tens of thousands of subscribers from over 205 countries who all have a desire to improve the state of education in this world. And for these interviews, we have selected a number of our subscribers who have achieved great things. And by great, I mean amazing. Think of former presidents, entrepreneurs, fashion designers, hospital builders, non-profit founders, authors, journalists, doctors, etc. And what all our guests have in common is that despite their great success, they've encountered many enormous challenges. So what were these challenges and how did they overcome them? That is what we are going to be talking about here. My name is Aldo de Pap and I'm massively looking forward and very grateful you can join us on this journey. So sit back, relax, and download the podcast here.
I mean, the best thing for global cooperation, kind of tongue-in-cheek, would be an alien invasion, because then us humans would suddenly feel all together and so forth. So we have these psychological mechanisms. But as you rightly point out, we see something similar now where you could say the international community kind of comes together in condemning the Russian invasion. I think up to a certain extent, we've also seen something similar with the COVID crisis, the pandemic. We're all in the same boat. And well, there have been definitely lots of struggles between nations, but there's also been, massive collaboration.
A very happy Thursday, everybody. I sincerely hope you are having a good week and that you have great plans ahead for hopefully a lovely weekend to come. I'm very excited to present to you a new episode, which is for the very deep thinkers among us. I really enjoyed this interview and would most definitely like to have this guest come back to our show for as many times as he can, as I feel he has the talent, experience, and above all, words to make us all properly reflect or think critically, as he says himself. Dr. Michael Vlerick is a philosopher, currently affiliated with Tilburg University in the Netherlands as an assistant professor in philosophy of science. He's an excellent lecturer, speaker, and thinker, and authored two very interesting books. And his most recent book that appeared last June is called Critical and Scientific Thinking, A Short Introduction. And the ebook version of this book is freely available to download for everyone who is keen to get their brain juices flowing. So if you're interested in that, check out our show notes where we have included a link to his book. I really enjoyed talking to Michael, as he is one of those people who can make very complex things and matters sound very easy. And whenever I speak to people like Michael, I feel the world is in very good hands, because thank goodness there are people who actually get it. They get how we humans think. So we talk about the difference between normal thinking and critical thinking. We talk about writing books, meditation, philosophy for dummies, and how to achieve world peace. I would say just your regular podcast banter. So if you're interested in any of the above, without further ado, listen to this interview with Dr. Michael Vlerick, episode 55, The Philosopher.
This podcast is brought to you by Smartest, an app that uses artificial intelligence to let you create interactive quizzes for your class in a few seconds. Get started for free on app.smartest.io.
Yes, and a very warm welcome to yet another episode of the Teach Pitch podcast. We are midsummers, and I am very happy that I have a guest here that I've been meaning to talk to for a while, because I think he's someone with a very extraordinary mind, and someone who has a profession that we haven't had before on this show. I have the great honor to have as my next guest Michael Vlerick. And Michael, you are a philosopher, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Aldo. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to talk to you and to be part of this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that I wanted to talk to you about, because I think that fascinates me, is what got you into philosophy? What made you choose? I mean, there were other people choose law or economics or maybe finance. You chose philosophy, which I think is an amazing choice. But what got you into it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, when I was in high school, I was taking Latin and Greek, and in the later years, I got into contact with ancient philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and that really triggered something in me. I was really interested in philosophy in general and in what these philosophers had to say. So I was really triggered by this kind of intellectual approach to rationally understand the world. But actually, I finished my bachelor in law, and then I switched afterwards to philosophy. And I would say I haven't looked back since then. Although after my master's in philosophy, I did go on to study something else. I went to Egypt, to Cairo, where I studied political science, and also I took a course in Arabic. And so it was my view then that maybe I could contribute something of value to the world by getting to know this culture. Obviously, this was post 9/11 and so forth, in the context of Muslim terrorism. And I wanted to understand the culture. I wanted to understand the religion. I very much enjoyed it as well. But after a while, after Egypt, I went back to work in Belgium for a while. But my love of philosophy never waned. And I would say the more I was looking at different things, it always came back to me. And then I took the decision to actually pursue that path and do a PhD in philosophy. And so that took me to South Africa for 5 years, including a postdoc. And then afterwards came back to Belgium with my wife by then and 2 little daughters born there. And I've been working in Tilburg since then.
Wow, what a journey! I mean, so many questions come to mind. One of the questions I have, because I studied political science or international relations in Utrecht, which I think is pretty close, is so you did your master's in philosophy, then you say, okay, I'm going to do political science, and then you go back to philosophy. So can you very quickly give me an idea of where you feel those two are similar? Did you feel there were going to be some overlaps between the two?
Yeah, interesting question. I do think there's definitely overlap, and I would say there's overlap with philosophy and any science, because quite often philosophy is being contrasted to science, but I think that's a misunderstanding of what philosophy is mostly about and what philosophy is historically about. I would say philosophy is the attempt to rationally understand the world. And philosophy was born when people stopped using mythological religious stories to explain whatever they saw in the world, but they tried to use their own senses and their own rational thinking in order to come up with theories about the world and where we fit in that world and so forth. So that's what the pre-Socratic philosophers did. And that is the major game changer, I would say, in relating to the outside world and in creating knowledge in kind of rational way. Now, when modern science saw the light with Newton, you could say, but then later on Adam Smith, many different very important scientists, well, all of these scientists, they still considered themselves to be philosophers. There wasn't a term for science back then. And so that was very much inscribed in that kind of project of understanding the world in a rational way, instead of, just taking religious or other kind of traditional stories in order to make sense of your world. It is only when the sciences were evolving at a quick pace and specializing rapidly, and so we've got very different kind of sciences, each with their own niche, that the sciences as, a kind of term got to be, and that philosophy actually got into a bit of a crisis, you could say, an identity crisis. Like, okay, this used to be all philosophy. Now sciences are taking over all of these elements. We still want to have this rational look, but we want to have a broader look. And from this kind of crisis, you could say, philosophy has been doing very different things. First of all, it's been writing and talking about all of these elements that couldn't quite be explained with a purely empirical approach, like moral philosophy, political philosophy, and so forth, how we should behave, how we should live together. But also, I would say in continental Europe, you got this kind of backlash against these sciences and a kind of philosophy that many people today will associate with philosophy, but actually it's just, one part of philosophy in a certain kind of time frame, which is to have these more kind of almost poetic and deep sounding thoughts about reality, about the purpose of life, and so forth.
Yeah, I get that there is a perception of philosophy being somewhat mythical, being, as you say, almost thinking about life, almost a metaphysical, the poetry element of it. But that's not, you're basically saying that's not the philosophy that you're into, or that has nothing to do basically with the academic field or the research field that you're very much immersed in. And there's definitely kind of a baseline when it comes to philosophy, and what you say about rationalizing certain aspects of our understanding, that all ties into philosophy, and that is what we could use. And I think I have one more question, sorry, before we dive into your first challenge. Why Cairo? Because, obviously it's like a cornerstone of loads of knowledge, but was there a specific reason that you said, I want to go study in Cairo?
The reason actually is that the language, the dialect, the Arabic dialect they speak in Cairo is the best understood dialect in the Arab world. And the reason for that is that there's there's loads of movies and music being made in Cairo. It's a bit of a cultural center in the Arab world. And therefore, that dialect is pretty well known. We have to know that, it's one language, Arabic, but actually the dialects are incredibly, incredibly diverse. So what people speak in Morocco is very, very different to what people will speak in Iraq, for instance, and so forth. So they'd have very different dialects because these linguistic groups were pretty isolated for a long time. And so they do have an official, written language, also the language of the Quran, for instance. But the spoken language can vary wildly. And so Egyptian is apparently the Egyptian dialect is one that is pretty well understood throughout the Arab world.
Nice, yeah. And I know that Egypt, of course, it is a massive country and also has the biggest film industry for the Arab world. So loads of their movies are being picked up on in other Arab countries, which is why the dialect is so influential in other countries. So 9 out of 10, you would hear the Egyptian version of Arabic because of the movies. So that's also why it's so strong. One of our previous guests was Ismail Serageldin, who's founding director of the Library of Alexandria. And he also spoke with great love about, Egypt being such a cornerstone of knowledge. And I was just thinking maybe there might also be kind of a philosophical parallel there, but which obviously there might have been, but I think your approach at that moment was a bit more practical. Let's dive into your first challenge, because I have many other questions to ask you, but I'm going to tie them into your first challenge. And you basically speak about your challenge of being a teacher. And by teacher, you mean you're currently working at Tilburg University, and at Tilburg University you are teaching philosophy to students who haven't necessarily chosen philosophy as their academic field. So they study economics, they study law, is that correct? Their focus is in other fields, but philosophy is an integral part of that. And then you come in and you try to teach them philosophy, and you say that's not always without its challenges, that's not a flawless process. Can you explain a bit more?
Yeah, definitely. So that is definitely the challenge. I do teach to philosophy students as well in a master program, but my major courses are what I call service teaching, so teaching philosophy to non-philosophy students in the bachelor economics, bachelor psychology, and different majors within these faculties. The challenge there is that, as many, people will be able to attest who took, university courses, and they had this kind of imposed philosophy course, as is often done, at universities. Quite often, it is very challenging for them. They're not that interested in philosophy. And so that is a challenge. And when I came to Tilburg, I was given this challenge, and they said, well, we really want you to kind of revise how you will do or change, the setup of the existing or the typical kind of philosophy of science course, because we see that with these students, they're really not enjoying this, but also, their grades are not up to par and so forth. So it was a real challenge to teach this group of students. Now, and I'm very happy to be given this challenge, because it really forced me to go out of the usual way of teaching philosophy of science. Well, philosophy of science is very much concerned with the question what science is, and explaining what philosophers and scientists have to say about science. And so typically what you will get is a kind of overview of 20th century and now 21st, but mostly 20th century philosophers, maybe some from the 19th century, but mostly 20th century, and what they had to say about how science relate, or how scientific theories relate to the outside world they're trying to describe. I mean, realists would say, well, they describe these things, these objects in the external world, they describe them literally, or can we just say that they have an instrumental value in starting to predict things and so forth, but we cannot say that there's actually a representation of the outside world in these theories. So you can imagine very high level theoretical reflections about science that are not directly relevant to doing the science itself, and especially not that relevant if you just want to apply, a science to certain kind of problems, like my business students. And so the way I kind of reconfigured that course and gave it a whole new spin is by saying, look, we shouldn't teach them theoretical stuff about science in general. What we really can do as philosophers, and what I think should be our mission, especially to non-philosophy students, is to improve their thinking in relevant ways. And so instead of teaching, these high-level theories about science, I started teaching them critical thinking skills, and then relating these skills back to some reflections about science and why science is reliable or not, and in which cases, and so forth. So instead of teaching them these very theoretical theories, I started my course with a bunch of, telling riddles, you could say, where, their spontaneous thinking predictably gets it wrong. And then start telling them, why do you think, your reasoning goes wrong in these contexts? And we started to think about improving our thinking, starting to think more critically, explain the origin of these reasoning errors. And so something that I believe can be of real value to anybody as a person is definitely of real value to anybody as a citizen of this world, especially in democratic countries where our reasoning and our decisions, they are reflected in how our countries are run and how we tackle our important societal problems. So I started to addressing all of these themes from the perspective of critical thinking, and I'm happy to say that really caught on. And so that is also where the book I've just published features in. So I've written all of this out in a book now, targeted at the students in the first place, but targeted at, or at least, I invite everyone with an interest to read it, because I think it might be relevant for everyone.
Yes, and we surely will. Critical and Scientific Thinking, A Short Introduction is the name of the book. And it's an ebook that is available for free to anyone who's interested. So we're going to be sure to include the link in our show notes and send it out to our newsletter and community of 60,000 people and counting, to incentivize them to read this book. Because I think it's very important, not only for your specific field, but I think, the way it's set up, there's something that speaks to me when it is about shortly stopping in our tracks and looking back at the way of how we think and how we interpret. And I think there's a lot to be said for also, not looking at that in isolation, not looking at that in our own little island of, in your case, is whether you're a lawyer or an economist or whether you're a technology builder or interviewer or whatever it is that you are, or investor, but also connecting the dots and seeing kind of what we have in common in the way we think, and what makes our thinking critical, and what makes us just being, sheepishly following an assumption. Because I think a lot that's being pushed out there through the way we engage with content, through the way we engage with other people's ideas, it doesn't really require this extra oomph in our thinking, right? There's a lot to be said for stopping your tracks and define what is critical thinking, because I can imagine that if we don't stop every now and then, we might think we're interpreting something where we aren't. We might be perhaps a little bit influenced or manipulated into thinking something that we didn't want to think in the first place. I might be giving a lot more gravitas to your book, but this is one of the things I consider to be very important, that we all just pause and reflect upon, okay, what should critical thinking be? How should we set ourselves up so we ask ourselves the right questions to genuinely grow?
Definitely, yeah. If I can just build on that, we also have to come to the realization that for the first time in human history, we live in a truly information age. I mean, information is abundant in our day and age, and that's a great thing. I mean, that's the first and necessary condition to come to better beliefs, to come to better opinions, is that you have access to proper information. And there's good information out there. The problem, however, is that there's also lots of very low quality and, frankly, deceitful information out there. And so it's very hard, and it's harder and harder to distinguish between, reliable sources of information and less reliable sources of information. We've seen it in the COVID debates, vaccination debates, and so forth. A lot of information is out there that is not critical at all, and that is actually pretty harmful. Now, it's one thing to be able to, and a very important thing, to be able to tell sense from nonsense when you receive information from the outside world. Another very important part of critical thinking as well is to question your own thinking, your own interpretation of these elements. And standard human thinking, all of humans, I would say, are vulnerable to a number of very specific reasoning errors. And so the first kind of step towards better thinking, more critical thinking, is being aware of these reasoning errors. And that is very much what I try to do in my courses. That is very much what I try to do in that book, by putting these reasoning errors out there and not just telling you, well, these are the type of errors we make. No, but actually making you experience it by giving you certain kind of riddles, certain kind of cases in which, human thinking predictably gets it wrong. And then asking the question, well, why is it wrong now, and how can we improve our thinking?
Can you give a practical example of a reasoning error?
Definitely. I think if there's just one I would name, I call it the mother of all biases, the mother of all reasoning errors, that is the confirmation bias. The fact that whenever we have, even the beginnings of an opinion, of a belief about something, we're much more open and receptive to all these pieces of information that confirm our pre-existing beliefs than we are to disconfirming pieces of evidence. And we're not aware of that. So it's like we get this kind of tunnel vision, and all we receive is information that kind of confirms our beliefs, and we miss all of or most of the other information. Now, that also leads to another important bias, the fact that we're massively overconfident in the accuracy of our beliefs. So when people estimate the chances of being right as in between like 80 to 90%, they're actually only right in not even half the cases. So they overestimate the likelihood of being right. But it gets even more interesting when people think the chances of them being wrong become extremely small. So people say, well, I'm so certain, I think the chances of me being wrong is like one in between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 1,000,000, whatever that means. But so, almost impossible to be wrong. Well, even in those cases, I think in 10% of the cases, they still give wrong answers. So, and that is the confirmation bias at work, because you only see confirming evidence for your beliefs. You miss all of the other information. You're thinking, well, impossible that I'll be wrong, because I only see confirmation.
That is the rabbit hole many of us are sucked into when we use, for instance, a tool like YouTube. If I watch, a video, about any political topic on YouTube, then, the next video that is suggested is supporting or confirming what I just saw. And then the next one will do that again and again and again and again. And I will watch so many of the same videos. So it's basically confirming this specific theory. And if that theory is flawed, I will have already watched so many of these videos. You can't get me change my ways anymore, because I'm already convinced, because I've seen 4 or 5 videos confirming what I thought and basically not feeding me with any opposite perspective. So I recognize very much this confirmation bias.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a good point. These algorithms by these social media sites, they massively reinforce or already existing confirmation bias. Yeah. So it's no wonder that people are locked up in so-called, echo chambers or filter bubbles, however they call them, because all you hear is your own echo. Whatever you're thinking, you're feeding into these algorithms. What you're fed back is everything that's echoing what you've been thinking and so forth. And know that the search engines we use to access more information through the internet actually feed into that. And that's worrisome, I would say. In a time where information can be very polarizing as well, and low quality information, or I could say, deceitful information, actually can be very harmful to the individual, but also to society as a whole.
Yeah. Thank you so much for explaining that in detail, Michael. So, Critical and Scientific Thinking, a Short Introduction, is your second book. Let's talk very quickly about your first book, which is called De Tweede Vervreemding, and freely translated, I think that would mean the second estrangement. Yes. So now that's a wonderful book published at Lano Publishers. When was it published?
It was published in 2019.
2019. And this is basically what I like about it. It's just like this book, you are trying to basically convey, fairly academic philosophy theory. You're trying to convey it to a mainstream audience, right? So you're trying to talk about specific philosophical ideas that anyone, even if you're not a philosophy student, can still understand and can use in people's day-to-day lives. Could you very quickly talk about your first book and kind of what made you want to write it?
Definitely. And actually, I did my PhD, so I wrote my PhD thesis on evolutionary epistemology. I was very much interested in knowledge and the creation of knowledge and whether we could trust knowledge and so forth. And so this later book, Critical Thinking, kind of is a reflection of that still. But so as a master's student, the only kind of approaches to the theory of knowledge, which is called epistemology in philosophy, it was a very kind of traditional approach where philosophers, you could say, from their armchair have their theories about what knowledge is and how reliable knowledge is and so forth. But what I was very much interested in, and this was a kind of new field, is a more naturalistic approach to knowledge. And by naturalistic, I mean scientifically informed. And recently there's been, I would say recently, meaning in the last decades, there's been a revolution in our understanding of the human mind, of the human brain, but also of the evolutionary origin of many of these cognitive faculties we have in evolutionary psychology, but also cognitive psychology and so forth. And so all of these very interesting theories have very important consequences for major philosophical questions. And the first philosophical question I took on was, okay, what is human knowledge? What can we know? Is our knowledge reliable or not? And that was very much my PhD thesis. And so I did that from an evolutionary perspective. But more and more doing so, I realized that shedding an evolutionary light, so a light informed by the theory of evolution, on important philosophical problems is extremely valuable, not just for the domain of knowledge, but also for other aspects, for other important questions. And so this kind of gradually led me to research on evolutionary ethics, like thinking about moral behavior, moral norms from an evolutionary perspective. And that would then ultimately lead me to that first book, in which I shed an evolutionary light on society as it is today and on the major societal problems of our times, and also the most promising solutions, I believe, to tackle these problems.
It is a wonderful book. It's published in Dutch. So for the Dutch-speaking listeners among us, it's available in the better bookshops and online, most definitely. One of the things that I'm thinking as you are describing it is one of the challenges I can imagine you are coping with is, in trying to get your knowledge to a mainstream audience. It's like there's a very holistic approach. So it's a lot of knowledge, and you kind of need to filter that knowledge more specifically to get it to that pinpoint. So it, as you say, like from how we deal with knowledge to, how we act and think in today's society. So how we encounter specific problems and how we communicate and whatever. So it sounds like a very, very chunky bit of knowledge that needs to be digested and needs to be understood before people can get to the crux of things.
Yeah, definitely. I would also take what I like to do is really zoom out on specific problems. So we have specific problems, let's say climate change, migration, and so forth. And there's a lot of very interesting things that already have been written about it and promising solutions and so forth. But I'd like to understand, society and these problems by taking a much wider view. And so the way I set up the book was by starting with asking the question, like, what kind of social beings are humans? And so we have to take an evolutionary perspective on that. And when we look at the research, well, it seems that we're quite exceptional as social beings, in the sense that humans, in contrast to other social beings, are wonderfully able to cooperate with a pretty large number of non-genetically related other organisms, conspecifics, other humans. Non-genetically related, why is that important? Well, if you're genetically related, like the bees, for instance, in a hive, they share not 50, but 75% of their genes with most other bees in that hive. And so we see that there's a massive amount of, altruistic behavior in these hives. Bees will sacrifice themselves for the hive. And that is something that makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective, because from that perspective, you're helping, or the genes that code for behavior, that kind of altruistic behavior, will help similar genes in these other organisms they're saving by that behavior.
Yeah.
So what is more puzzling is when people who are not, or organisms, because it's not just people who do that, but organisms who are not genetically related cooperate with one another. That's more puzzling, but it did evolve. It did obviously evolve in humans. It also evolved in other species like vampire bats, who will share blood. They feed on blood of mammals. That's why they get their names. But anyways, these creepy little creatures are actually wonderful examples of altruism with conspecifics, with other bats, because they will share by regurgitating blood. They will share some of what they were able to feed on with other animals who were less lucky. And importantly, these animals are not their offspring or very closely related organisms only. They're also other bats in the group. And there's a bunch of other examples in nature. But humans do excel in that respect. We also excel in the way we're able to cooperate in a very flexible manner. We have language, so we can, set up different kind of cooperative plans with one another. It's not just genetically wired, the kind of things we do to the kind of cooperations we set up. And even more importantly, well, humans cooperate over time, over generations. meaning that we're able to somehow pool our knowledge and leave traces of that knowledge. Even before writing, we're able to do so, but definitely once we've invented writing. And therefore, we can build on the knowledge of previous generations. And that leads to this kind of process of cumulative cultural evolution, in which in human groups, we see that throughout time, generally, but not always, but mostly, culture will become more complex, innovations will become better. And so there's this kind of progress throughout time. And that is very much what makes humans special in the animal kingdom, and what kind of explains our dominance on this planet. The fact that we build on the knowledge of others. Because the modern human organism, the modern human brain, has been around for 200,000 years. But for the first 190 or even 195,000 years in most regions in the world, well, that didn't lead us much further than, tending to fire and making some rudimentary tools to hunt and then to scrape food out of skins and so forth. But so very basic behavior, complex behavior, definitely, but very basic behavior with these massive brains. Now, what really did change is what I would call the first alienation, and you see where my title is going to come from that book. The second alienation was with one particular innovation that would change the fate of humanity, and that is the agricultural revolution. Now, because of the agricultural revolution, we see that groups of humans would massively expand because there's much more calories to go along. They would become sedentary, that we all know, but they would also become much, much larger. And that brings a lot of problems. So we have cooperative problems. We have more conflict within the group. So we need rules, we need laws, we need more hierarchy. We see all of these things happening. But interestingly as well, we see that the rate of innovation really takes off, because now you truly have a group that can specialize, that can build on the knowledge of others. So for a cooperative species, that is, the starting gun for a process of massive progress. And this kind of would lead us to new kind of technological innovations that would once again, to new kind of technologies that would radically alter the fabric of our societies. And these would be communication and transport technologies. And because of these technologies, streams of goods, of ideas, information, but also of people, are no longer contained within the group, so travel easily to other groups. And this has ushered us in the era of globalization, coming with incredible possibilities. Never has the group of cooperating humans been as large as today. So we see again that the rate of innovations is kicked into a bigger gear, but also comes with very important challenges, because for the first time in human history, in order to deal efficiently with our important societal problems, we have to cooperate on a global level. And this is something for which our evolved psychology is not made. Well, we've evolved to cooperate wonderfully well in our small groups of 150 people. We're not made to cooperate with people on the other groups. In fact, we evolved to be naturally, I would say, suspicious and even hostile in certain contexts towards people from other groups. And this makes all perfect evolutionary sense. But now we've come in this kind of new context, and we need to overcome our innate tribalism in order to deal with our important challenges today. And that's a major challenge. And in the book, I'll go on to explain what, or at least, give my view on what the most promising ways to do so are, based on research in social psychology and so forth.
We are proudly supported by Tony's, who have created a product that I absolutely love called Tonybox. It's an audible tool that allows the discovery of our world's most beautiful stories for children of all ages. We are the proud owner of a Tonybox, and our 3-year-old daughter listens to the Tony stories religiously, whether this is the Gruffalo, Cookie Monster, or her all-time favorite Elsa from Frozen. Loads of figurines that fit on the box, and loads who are dying to tell you their story. Now, what I particularly love about the Tonybox is that there is no screen involved. So you can basically use the box at any moment of the day, just before bedtime or as we do during bath time. Now, Tony's is also making tremendous strides improving their product for teachers from all over the world so they can grow their lessons. And if you want to know more about what Tony's is doing, you can go to us.tonys.com/pages/Tonys-for-teachers. That is /pages/Tonys-for-teachers, where you can find lots more information about all the beautiful new products they are creating. From the classroom starter set to the school expansion pack to the 6-pack school bundle. Loads of fun and lots to learn with Tony's.
One of the things I was wondering is, an obvious example, you cannot ignore it, of course, is the conflict around Ukraine and the war that's ongoing in Ukraine. But what I think I see, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that we are able to line up against the common aggressor here, which is Russia. So even though we might not be 100% aligned, left, right, and center, there is a clear condemnation, almost on a global level, I think with the exception of Syria and North Korea. But globally, we are able to condemn one aggressor saying what you're doing is wrong. Is there in our thinking something that if we have a common enemy, we are more inclined to partner and collaborate?
Definitely, yeah. So that's a very interesting case in many different ways, and maybe I can explain a few of these elements, because obviously the book was published and written before the war in Ukraine, but it's definitely something that is important to reflect on and apply some of these concepts to. Now, as you say, a common enemy will kind of bind a group together. So in the book, I also say, the best thing for global cooperation, kind of tongue-in-cheek, would be an alien invasion, because then us humans would suddenly feel all together and so forth. So we have these psychological mechanisms. That's a very strong psychological mechanism. But as you rightly point out, we see something similar now, where you could say the international community kind of comes together in condemning the Russian invasion. I think up to a certain extent, we've also seen something similar with the COVID crisis, the pandemic. We're all in the same boat. And there have been definitely lots of struggles between nations. Remember the beginning of COVID, where they were hoarding medicine, masks, and so forth. But there's also been, massive collaboration, especially on the scientific front, in which pharmaceutical players who would otherwise, protect their research and knowledge, now were sharing everything they had, because they knew that we just had to get to proper vaccines, proper medicines as quickly as possible to deal with this pandemic. So a major global, you could say, problem has the power as well to kind of unite us globally in the face of that challenge. And we can only hope that we'll take some of that to that biggest of all challenges, I would argue, climate change, biggest of all global challenges, and that we make more and quicker progress on that field as well. But maybe because you mentioned the war in Ukraine, I think it also gives us an interesting perspective on where it goes wrong. And I think that there's a number of elements there. But a first very important one is that it shows once again the importance of having, democratic governance, or at least, governance in which decisions are not made by one single person. Because if a single person, for whatever reasons, makes certain kind of decisions and everybody else is kind of forced to agree with that person otherwise, or at least has been selected to agree with that person, because all those who didn't agree were pushed aside, we see that the chance of conflict rises massively. There's this interesting research about forms of government and military conflicts, and it seems that, unsurprisingly, in democratic nations, and especially in democratic nations where there's a lot of debate going on before a decision is being taken, so there's not much power in the head of just one person, one individual, like a president, for instance, well, the chances of conflict are radically reduced. And there can be a number of reasons for that. You could say, well, people don't want to send their children to the slaughter and so forth. They don't want to fight in costly wars. But mostly as well, and this kind of relates to the critical thinking issue, it protects against one of these biases I've already mentioned, the overconfidence bias and the overconfidence of kind of winning a conflict. If you kind of go through a historical analysis of the lead up to major wars and major conflicts like the First and the Second World War, what we typically see on both sides of the conflict, and especially on the side of, you could call it the aggressor, is incredible overconfidence in the military, quite often superiority of one's own forces. And so typically they will think like, oh, this is going to be a very quick operation. We're going to just obliterate the enemy in a few months, and we're going to celebrate as victors very soon. And typically, as we also know from history, this is not the case. It is much more costly on both sides, and it drags on much longer. And perhaps another important element, and something which I also mention in the book, one of the major drivers of pacification throughout the 20th and especially the second half of the 20th century is feminization, according more value to women within the group, within the nation, but also allowing women to come to positions of power seems to have a very strong reducing factor on the chances of conflict. And there's a good evolutionary reason for that. We call it the male warrior hypothesis. Now, the male psyche was kind of shaped in context of very strong group competition throughout a very long time, and men who were willing to kind of fight the other group and be this kind of male warrior, despite the obvious risks of these undertakings for your own life. Well, they came on top. If they came on top as victors, they had a lot of status within the group, and with that status came lots of reproductive opportunities. So there seems to have been a pretty strong selective force on being willing to fight for whatever cause in especially young men. And this is something we see in all cultures. In all cultures, boys are more likely than girls to enjoy, violent movies, but especially and more problematically to sign up for any kind of military operation. And so there's an evolutionary reason for that. We have to know the weaknesses and the strengths of both sexes. And in this case, well, it's quite obvious that women have a very important role to play, because if you leave it to just men, but especially male autocrats, well, you predictably get a world full of conflict and violence.
Nothing as toxic as the male ego. So I'm all for it, bringing the considerate women into the mix and making sure everything is balanced out. And it's so funny that, wherever you look, I have a 3-year-old daughter. When she's on the playground, you see her playing with the objects on the playground, right? She imagines that she's in a castle, there's entire stories, but she plays with the objects on the playground, whether this is the slide, whether this is a ladder, whether this is a little house. If you have 3-year-olds her age boys, they will go to the playground and they will try to take down the object. So already they have in their minds, and they also have a story, but their story is, I'm going to take down this playground. So it's very funny that they engage with the objects, but their kind of take on playing is already, we're going to take this down for some reason. And I think it's funny that they are already in kind of the demolition mood, whereas the girls of her age are more like, okay, we're going to play on top of this. And mind you, she climbs on the roof, or she climbs on things she's not supposed to climb on, but she still works with the objects. Whereas the boys are already like, okay, now we need to take this down. Of course, they fail, thank goodness, to demolish anything. But just the thought of them demolishing it's just a funny process to see. And I always wonder, where does this come from? Because, I'm not giving my daughter any instructions. She could also start demolishing, but she doesn't. So anyway, this is just, my light observation into male versus female already at a young age. And I'm sure there are countless of examples.
Yeah,
on this
exactly.
subject.
And that's the
Yeah,
interesting thing. And quite often when I present some of these findings, I get quite a lot of resistance you would expect from men, but that's not the case. I actually get a resistance from many women because in the recent feminist movements, there's been this emphasis that, the only differences between boys and girls, men and women, and obviously all of these differences are on average, and you will find men
of
that
course. Yeah,
much better fit the female profile and vice versa. But on
yeah,
average, well, that all of these differences are cultural differences. But as you rightly point out, it's not that you will educate your boys different than your girls, for instance, and so forth. And still, they do behave differently. And so it's very much innate. I mean, the kind of tasks they had to perform and the kind of life they had to prepare for throughout evolutionary times was a very different life and a different kind of challenges, and therefore wired in the brain are differences
yeah,
between boys and girls, and
yeah, yeah,
that's just a very basic fact of human psychology.
yeah. That's good. We need to have healthy debates around these things to get to know ourselves better, right? That's that we always at all times should be open to other people's perceptions and
Yes.
and
And
have a
that's
healthy
definitely not
discussion
going
about
against feminism because,
it.
well, I'm a very much, I consider myself being a feminist for what I've just said. I think
Yeah,
we don't just need to do it, we also need to do it because it's more for social justice purposes, but we need to give equal opportunities and so forth to women,
yeah,
obviously, but also for, having a better society, as I just mentioned. So very important there.
yeah. Definitely. Thank you so much, Michael. We've actually already discussed your second challenge because your second challenge you had written down is that you, as a researcher, find it challenging at times to convey your academic knowledge to a mainstream audience. And I think in detail you've explained, how you've been doing this. You've been doing this through the process of teaching, but also through writing. Is there any other format? Do you speak? Do you have a podcast? Is there anything else that you are doing to convey your knowledge to a bigger audience?
Yeah, so I do speak quite a lot for groups on the issues we've just talked about.
Mm,
So I try to do that as much as possible. During COVID, I've also had these kind of online seminars and so forth to try to reach a larger audience. Because as you rightly point out, I think, especially as a philosopher, it is our kind of duty to share some of these insights and these ideas and these discussions we're having with a larger audience. Because quite often in academic, well, I call it baking cookies for other cookie bakers, right? We write
yeah,
our academic papers and they're read by, I would say, 50, perhaps 100 other researchers in our field if we're lucky, and we get a few citations and we cite back. And then so, okay, knowledge is advancing. And I really understand that in a scientific context, this is very important that you have this kind of, I would say, high level debate on very specific issues and advancing knowledge in certain domains. But I would say that is mostly or incredibly important in the natural sciences, in the human sciences as well, in the applied sciences. But in philosophy, it definitely has its role as well. But I would say the role, since we're taking this larger view and we're talking about these problems that actually are relevant and important to everyone out there, our role is primarily to kind of communicate with a larger audience and to frame some of these interesting scientific findings in a new light and
yeah,
to show them how they are relevant to a larger audience and doing so strive for a better world.
yeah. And then to your third challenge, and this is a little bit off topic, but still very important to you, and that's all around self care and well being. And this has been your own journey in your path. I'd be interested to know how your well being and staying in shape and all those things. How has that affected you as a philosopher and as a writer?
Yes, that's an interesting question because would say the causal arrow goes in both directions.
Mm,
So I've always been very much fond of endurance sports. Like I triathlon, cycling, running, and so forth. So always done that because I'm actually it's something I really enjoy. I've been doing since a young age, and I used to do it pretty competitively. Not anymore, but I still enjoy very much the training. So that aspect has always been part of my life, I would say. But more recently, and this is where the causal arrow goes the other way, I've been reading up on these very interesting findings in positive psychology. And so positive psychology is the branch of psychology that is concerned not with, I would say, curing mental diseases, but actually improving the well-being of people who are, you would say, neurotypical, right? So the focus is not so much on how can we bring somebody back to normal, very important, of course, cure depression, for instance, but how can we get people who are just doing okay, doing fine, to more well-being, to more enjoyable life, for lack of a better word. And so this is something that's been, I mean, I was very interested in that research, both on a theoretical, intellectual level, because I'm very interested in psychology in general. But I'm also, of course, pretty interested in that for applying it to my own life. And especially, the research that's been done on meditation in the last, I would say, decades, mostly mindfulness, but there's different kinds of meditation. And the results they got there are incredibly promising. I mean, they show that a regular daily meditation habit, leads to all kinds of advantages or benefits, like better health, even lower blood pressure, better sleep, and so forth. But also more well-being, being more attuned to being more present in the moment. This all sounds pretty vague, but it is actually something that can measurably lead to better well-being. We also see something very interesting. I think that's if there's any kind of breakthroughs in neuroscience and neuropsychology in the last decades, that is that our brains, or physical brains, are much more moldable than we once assumed, even at an adult age. So we see that by meditating, for instance, the amygdala in the brain, which are kind of the fight or flight center of the brain, so leading to that kind of attacking or evading kind of behavior that's so important in the natural world, where there's all of these hunting opportunities, but you can also be hunted if you're a human, and other humans can threaten your survival as well. So a very important, strong, evolved center in the brain, but that in our modern day and age quite often leads to the wrong response and to a serious decrease in health and well-being, because it gives us, chronic stress. It will give us a higher heart rate and higher blood pressure, but actually the only thing we're doing is public speaking. We're not having to run away from any kind of predator. So completely wrong kind of response, but evolutionary hardwired, and leading to all kinds of troubles, and especially leading to decreased well-being. And so all of these, you could call them techniques, they lead to address all of these important, issues that decrease our well-being in our modern day and age, and have always done so. But before long, we didn't really know, there wasn't any kind of scientific validation for that. Buddhist monks were doing that for ages and for centuries. And yes, they look pretty peaceful from the outside, but we've never even thought of studying what it actually does to these humans, and to humans in general, and to their brains. Now, some 20 or 30 years ago, for the first time, they put some of these monks in brain scanners, and what they saw was, perplexing to these researchers. They saw that these regions of fight, flight, and so forth were just tiny compared to those of other human beings. They also saw that the kind of brain waves that were going around in these brains when they were meditating on certain things that are associated with incredible peak experience of well-beings could just, be almost turned on at will, and so forth. And so what they basically discovered is that well-being, first of all, comes from, the interior, from the self, and that there are very specific techniques that you can apply to radically increase your well-being, and doing so also increase the well-being of people around you. Because as we all know, and this is obviously also something that research shows people who feel better, have higher well-being. Well, they interact in more altruistic ways, are nicer to other people. So it's very much something that will spread. As is the opposite, people who are very stressed and who have a very low well-being. Well, they will also, you could say, spread those bad vibes to people around them.
Yeah. And so you apply it. So you are meditating yourself now daily?
Yes, I have this kind of daily meditation habit. It started out pretty low key with like 10 minutes. I had this meditation app, Calm, which I can definitely recommend, but there's many others like Headspace and Insight Timer is even a free one. And so that was really good to get that habit going. So I had this like 10 minutes of daily meditation, and I'm kind of this kind of motivated person as well. So there was this streak. I mean, once you didn't meditate for a day, your streak ended. So I was kind of motivated to keep my streak going. And so all of these, tools kind of help you to make it a habit. I've kind of expanded it as well. I'm now meditating for an hour to 2 hours a day almost.
Oh, wow.
And I would say that it does definitely increase my well-being. It also kind of increases your ability to concentrate. And so I feel that although I invest quite some time in meditation, well, I actually get my work done in less time than before. So it definitely makes up for that.
Wow, my hat's off to you, because I know you have a busy life. So, also being a father of three, so kind of, where you kind of all program that in, because that's often just a challenge for me. Is like I want to, but I'm not yet over the obstacle of finding the right time for it. But then again, as I say these words, I also know, like, stop finding excuses and just go ahead and plan it in. But for people like myself who are struggling with this, what would you advise them to do?
Yeah, that's an important question, because the major challenge is always getting a habit going. Research shows that in order to get a habit going, and what happens once it's a habit, that is that it doesn't take any mental energy for you anymore, and that you do it without having to think, and that you kind of won't forget it, right? And so there's two important things there. First of all, always do it at the same time. And if you can, also give yourself some kind of reward for it. But that reward can be pretty stupid, like me and my app, and just the fact that my streak wasn't ended. Apparently turned out to be enough reward for me to really get that habit going. So the best thing to do is often is doing it first thing in the morning or last thing at night. The effort becomes less and less. So there's less and less, psychological effort, like willpower in order to do it. And the benefits are really enhanced. So you actually feel great doing it. You feel great after doing it. From past experiences on an intuitive level that it makes you feel good. So you're actually looking forward to that moment of meditation. Yeah. But it takes a month or two to get to that point.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much for everything you've been sharing here in this interview. It's been incredibly interesting. And we're at the end of this interview, but before we close off, I always ask two questions that I ask to each and every one of my guests. And the first one is around recommended reading. So to those people who are listening to us today, and we've spoken about critical thinking, we've spoken about so many things, which book would you advise them to read?
Actually, I have to do justice to the book that started the whole philosophy journey for me, and I have it here. It's a book in Dutch by a Dutch researcher, and it's called Evolutionair Denken, so evolutionary thinking, by Chris Busquets. He's a professor at Nijmegen, I think, and I have met him a few times since then. And so this is kind of this book that very nicely describes how evolutionary theory has a profound impact on very different areas, such as knowledge, but also society, psychology, and so forth. So gives a bit of an overview of the research that is being done. So that's very much a first one. But then there's also been incredibly interesting, if we go to critical thinking, incredibly interesting research done by actually two researchers. They spearheaded that whole movement, and those are Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, Thinking Fast and Slow. So that's definitely also a book that kind of triggered things in me. Yeah.
Yes, well, two beautiful recommendations. Chris Boske's book, is it available in English? Did you know?
I don't think so. I'm not
Okay.
sure. I don't think so. It's sadly enough in Dutch, but who knows? Maybe it's
No,
been translated by now. But
it inspired you, and that's all we need to know. So thank you for sharing these two recommendations. And then my very last question. Now let's turn the tables. This is the Dr. Michael Vlerick podcast. Who would be on your guest list? Who would be your number one guest for your program?
well, there's a host of different people I would like to have on, and not just scientists, but I'd also like to hear from the people who've actually been practicing this, like Olympic athletes practice their sports. And these are the expert meditators, Buddhist monks like Mathieu Ricard, who's actually a French monk. He comes from France. He's very influential. He's written about the subject, and he talks about the subject quite often.
Nice, yeah. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk us through your thinking. Thank you so much for talking about your book, Critical and Scientific Thinking, a short introduction. As I mentioned before, we will share a link to this book to everyone listening in and everyone who wants to read it. We can highly recommend for you to do so. Michael, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Come back anytime. All the best to you, Dr. Michael Vlerick.
If you liked this episode of the Teach Pitch podcast, then it would mean the absolute world if you could share it with your friends and or give it a short review on your preferred podcast platform. The more you share your ideas about these interviews, the more people will find out about them. So do let us know what you think. We'd be very, very grateful.
Special thanks to Philip Anderson for our beautiful theme music. This podcast was produced and edited by Natalie Piles, project coordination by Inva Saini, and production assistance by Genta Metalia.